where's everybody from? Like, I mean, I'm a Sooke. Like, I recognize only about half the people in the room, and I'm going, okay, this is not all Sooke here. Who do we have from Victoria? Whoa, thank you for making the ride. Wow, Duncan. Woohoo. Yay. The islands, the outer islands. Woo. Yay. This, from Seattle. Oh my gosh. And anybody from the mainland? Oh wow, wow. Ontario. Especially for this. Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay. So Starhawk, as you all know, is a prolific writer and filmmaker. She's written many books on earth activism, on neo-paganism, eco-pagan feminism. She's just had such an incredible, profound ability to weave together spirit, activism, and bring a message that's really touching people's lives and touching the way people do life. So without further ado, I want to welcome with great aplomb Starhawk.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here tonight in Sooke. I come to the island pretty much every year to teach a course at our eco-village, which is in Shawnigan Lake, a wonderful, wonderful place and model of sustainable living and community. And we teach a 2-week-long permaculture design course with a grounding in spirit and a focus on organizing and activism. So it's nice to get a chance to get out for a little bit, see another little part of the island. I'm speaking tonight really at some very, very challenging moments in human history. I think we are at a time where sort of, you know, I think the surrealists would have loved this time. You know, we're at a moment where we are facing the most enormous crisis that we could imagine facing, the crisis of climate change, of our human impact on the basic life support systems of the earth. And the most bizarre thing about this crisis is how hard it is to get anyone to pay any attention to it. Climate change is not the central issue that I think it deserves to be in your upcoming elections, in our decisions about what we do around the future. We're also facing another enormous crisis, I think on a global scale, and that is the social justice crisis. The crisis that comes from this concentration of wealth and power into fewer and fewer hands, and the leeching away of resources and empowerment from poor people and middle-class people, and the incredible violence and viciousness that the powers that be are willing to employ to keep their power. I actually think those two crises are the same crisis. They're not separate. Those are the same forces that are clinging to fossil fuels like dinosaurs gripping with their claws and refusing to let go. And in order to shift that and change that, I think it's more than just changing, you know, what kind of fuel goes into our tanks or what kind of light bulbs we put into our lights. It's really about shifting and changing our way of thinking and our consciousness. Now, in some sense, I think probably most of us here in this room would not claim to be indigenous in the sense of our long, long, long remote ancestors having lived here. Most of us come, I think, from people and families who are immigrants and incomers and migrants and have come here from somewhere else. But all of us come from people who, at some point, were indigenous to somewhere. All of us carry that heritage because our ancestors, wherever they did come from, lived in deep connection and relationship to the land and the environment around them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived. So I think all of us have somewhere in us that heritage, that capacity. And I think one of the things we are called to do right now, in a sense, is to sort of re-indigenize ourselves, to make a shift from the worldview of our modern or postmodern age, which is abstract and up in the head and often very disconnected from nature. It sees nature and human beings and culture as separate and split, and return to an understanding that human beings are nature. Now, I didn't even say we're part of nature. We are nature. We're not separate. That we are as dependent today on our natural environment as we might have been 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. Just works a little bit differently. So when we talk about making that shift in worldview, I think of it, have you ever gone out at night, a dark night, no moon, and you have a little tiny flashlight and you're trying to find the way, and that flashlight shows you like a few leaves here and maybe a stone there, and you have to kind of wave it back and forth to actually figure out where the trail is. But if you want to look at that one leaf, you can look at it really well with that flashlight. That's the kind of worldview that I think Western civilization has cultivated, where we illuminate one thing at a time and look at it and see it as separate and isolated from everything else around it. The kind of worldview I think we need to truly address climate change would be more like turning that flashlight off for a moment and standing there and waiting till your eyes adjust to the starlight. And when you do that, sometimes, even though it seems like there's hardly any light to see by, you become aware that actually there is. And actually that path looks just a little different. Maybe it's shining just a little more than the land around it, and the trees around it. And that if you tune in, you can actually find your way using more of your senses and more of your intuition, and you actually feel more part of that night than you do when you're fixated on that one little beam. So I think the shift that we need to make is from a worldview that sees the world as composed of separate, isolated objects to a worldview that understands that the world is relational. That it's about interconnections and relationships, and that nothing in nature, nothing in the world is truly separate from anything else. To me, that understanding is a powerful basis for approaching the kinds of changes and the ways that we need to heal and repair the world. And it's also, I think, a ground for what we can only call ethics or morality. And I think we need them now, desperately. Like, there are certain things that decent human beings don't do. And we need to hold people to that. Decent human beings don't take health care away from children. Decent human beings don't let other people starve when you could be feeding them. Decent human beings don't trash the environment around them and make messes that no one can clean up, or messes that they expect somebody else to clean up. Decent human beings don't profit off other people's misery. We have a lot of talk in the US about the moral majority and, values and all of that. I think if you go to the heart of really all the religions, they all share that same set of values and actually preach that same set of values. And I think you can derive that from the Bible if that is your religion. But I also think you can derive those same values from my religion, which is the understanding that nature, that those life support systems that sustain us, that interconnected web of life is sacred. And that sacredness infuses every single one of us. Each human being on the planet is, you could say, an aspect of what we like to call a goddess. Each of us holds that divine spark within us, and each of us is precious and should be cherished and should be supported and nourished and nurtured to express that spark in as bright and beautiful a way as we possibly can. So to make that shift, we have certain tools. There's several that I like to use in my life. And people sometimes wonder, what do they have to do with each other? One of them is magic. And I always like Diane Fortune's definition of magic. She was an occultist back in the 20th century, the early part. And she defined magic as being the art of changing consciousness at will. I think of it as our ancient psychology. I also think it's a great definition for political activism. That really what it should be about is not just changing who takes power, but changing the consciousness that has allowed us to do terrible things and shifting it over to a consciousness that encourages us to do things that are regenerative and healing. That definition of magic includes art, which implies a vision. And one of the teachings of magic, right, is that in order to do anything, you need to begin with a clear intention. And that intention has to include your vision of what you want. It can't just be your vision of what you don't want. You can't set out and do a love spell and say like, okay, great goddess Aphrodite, don't send me another rotten lover like the one I just got rid of, right? Because what you'll have in your mind is that rotten lover you just got rid of, right? And that's the picture you hold in your mind. That's the picture that focuses and attracts and directs the energy. There's actually a linguist, George Lakoff, who's a scientist who studies human perception and language and how they interact. And he has a book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And he says, no one cannot think of an elephant, right? Because as soon as you say elephant, that elephant is in your mind. So the human mind, our subconscious, or what we like to call your younger self, that part of you that's emotional and that responds to images and sensations and tastes and touches and smells. It's kind of like a dog. And if you have a dog, anyone ever had a dog and said like, oh, I'm so sorry, Rover, but I'm really tired tonight. I don't feel like taking you for a walk. You know, what kind of response do you get? Walk, walk, walk. Yeah, right. Because Rover doesn't get the not part, right? And here's walk, and that's, right? Yeah. Well, we're kind of like that in our deep unconscious mind. We hear, right? Even when we're out there, crusading for peace and we're yelling, no war, no war, no war. Some part of us is hearing, war, war, war. So I think one of the teachings that comes from both that magical tradition and also from current psychology and linguistics is that we have to have a vision. We have to know what it is we want and not just what we don't want. And there are times, I believe, we do have to strongly stand up and say no. And that can be a very, very powerful act. Because if we don't say no, then we allow something really destructive and damaging to occur. Any of you ever heard New Age people say something like, well, I don't like to resist because what you resist persists. I think that's a total misreading of how the world works on an energetic level. What you don't resist, believe me, really will persist. Sometimes you need to really strongly say, no, stop, not in my name, we're not going there. But I think that no is always stronger when you know what the yes is. So if you have a vision, then you can be working toward that vision, you can put that vision out, and you can start pouring energy toward that vision. So I wanted to share a couple little pieces of, I've spent a lot of time visioning and writing about it, written a novel called The Fifth Sacred Thing that's set in the mid-21st century and incorporated some of the visions that I had for what we could potentially be. And I've written a sequel to it called City of Refuge. I just wanted to read you. In the sequel here, in the Fifth Sacred Thing in that world, Northern California has become this beautiful, ecotopian, feminist, diverse, ecologically balanced kind of place, albeit after massive environmental and social breakdown. But Southern California has gone the opposite direction. And the story really wrestles with the question, how does a peaceful society defend itself when it's confronted with violence? How can you respond to cruelty and violence without becoming what you're fighting against? And I won't spoil it for you. But I will say that in the end, they do succeed in getting the Southlands out of their city and turning a lot of the soldiers who've come up, and really they invite them. They say there's a place for you at our table if you will choose to join us, and many do. So when City of Refuge starts, they're left with all of these soldiers wandering around their beautiful eco-feminist utopian city who totally weren't raised that way. Totally have no background for it, have no education, aren't sure what to do with themselves, and suddenly it's like, oh, okay, it's all right to invite everyone to our table, but when they sit down and they've got their elbows all over it and they're eating up all the food, what do we do? So City of Refuge to me really centers around the question of how do we build a new world when people are so deeply damaged by the old? And so I want to read you a moment between some of the soldiers and the children of the city that incorporates some of my vision of what the world might be if we imagined our cities as places. If our urban design was oriented to make places where children could be completely safe to wander around anywhere in the city, and where the whole city was designed to be a learning experience for the kids. So River is one of the soldiers. And as they're all sitting around, he's looking at the kids and the gardens that have been kind of destroyed by the invaders but are now being rebuilt. The workers around him, River noticed, were mostly young teens and even small children. The adults were working on structures and buildings, leaving the garden repair to the younger ones. In the center of the garden stood a red sphere on a pedestal. "What's that?" River asked one of the older girls. "That's Mars." She looked up at him, her dark straight hair framing an owlish face. "What's Mars?" Thick glasses hid her dark eyes. She was a bit on the old side, but already she had the eyes of the Khalifian women, looking straight into his with no fear or no submission, as if she were a person looking at another person, one she didn't think much of. "It's our neighbor planet," she told him. "What's a planet?" She looked at him sharply, as if she suspected he were joking. "We're standing on one. The Earth is a planet, like a giant ball circling the sun." "Crazy shit." "It's true. How come we don't fall off then?" "Gravity holds us on." "What's gravity?" "Gravity is the Earth's love for her children, holding us close," she said, as if repeating something she'd memorized. "Hey, Tubos," River shouted to his old unit, "come hear this." The girl called her friends over, and the children soon discovered that the soldiers knew almost nothing about the world. They had been taught to read, write, and count, mostly for the convenience of their commanders, but they'd never been given storybooks or even textbooks on anything other than weapons and the simplest of military tactics. Their entertainment came from vid screens, vid games, and failing that, cards. They didn't know that the Earth turned around the sun or that compost made soil. They knew nothing of history and were unaware that Califia and the Southlands had once been part of the same state, one of 50 in the same country. They had rarely seen the night sky before they made the long march to the north, and it hadn't occurred to most of them to wonder what those pinpoints of light in the heavens were. Stars had to be explained to them. "Help us rebuild this learning track," the girl said, "and we'll teach you things." "That's an order?" 3-2 asked. The girl frowned. "If you want to be. It's an offer." "An order," River said firmly. The girl held out her hand. "I'm Jasmine. What's your name?" "River." He took her hand and stood looking at it, not sure what to do with it or why she extended it at him. She grasped his, pumped it vigorously, and let it drop. "These other chipsters here don't got names, just numbers," River told her. "So what's this track thing about?" "It's how we learn here. There's different tracks that run all through the city with different learning stations. Right now, we're on the solar system track, and this is the Mars station. The next one out would be Jupiter and then Saturn. It's like a giant scale model. This ball is how big Mars would be if the sun were as big as a giant model of the sun. It used to be in the central plaza. And it's as far away as Mars would be if it were this big." River and the other soldiers just looked at her, mystified. So Jasmine explained that on the solar system track, every planet had a learning station. Mars had its sphere, and around it were gardens with herbs that belonged to Mars and flowers in martial colors, along with statues of war gods from many cultures, Ares and Chongo and Thor. Each had a port for the intelligent crystals that the children wore around their necks. When they touched them to the ports, holograms jumped out with stories, myths, and explanations. They could listen to the Greek and Roman myths or hear the Scandinavian Eddas, and then compare them to the Marvel comics, Thor, and the movies. They could watch video from the early Mars rovers or access the scientific reports from expeditions the scientists had mounted, back when people could still do such things, before the collapse. In their learning groups, they might delve further into the mysteries of space exploration, or write and perform their own Mars space opera, or read Mars-centered science fiction, or create a strategy game about a Mars expedition. So that's a little glimpse of a vision. And like I said, I think in these times it's especially important to have vision. Because it's really easy to get ground down under the press of urgency and hopelessness and despair and accept sort of, what they like to tell us, which is that we're doomed and there's not much we can do about it. I don't believe that we are doomed unless we accept that we are. I actually believe that hope and possibility and potential are infinite in the universe, and that the earth and that human culture have enormous powers of healing and resilience that we can tap once we make up our minds to do so. So I think we need to know both what our vision is and also what the real solutions and what the real approaches are that we can take to deal with climate change. And again, it doesn't mean that everybody has to go build themselves a cob house and plant a food forest. That's probably not how the change is going to happen. But I think the things that you can learn and see from someone who has done that, and from understanding in that very visceral way what it means to put together systems where the rain, collects and provides some of your drinking water and your washing water, and your gray water from your laundry and your sink go down and irrigate your orchards, and the fruit from the orchard provides some of the food you eat and feeds your chickens, and it's all integrated and all connected. That's something that can help us make that shift in consciousness. So one of the other tools I use besides magic is permaculture, which is a whole system of ecological design. It draws a lot on indigenous knowledge and wisdom and traditional knowledge from many, many parts of the world. It was started by two Australians, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, back in the 70s. And it's really grown into a worldwide movement. And I got involved in it after many decades of writing about the goddess and earth-based spirituality, and my feeling that we needed to make the shift on a deep spiritual, community, cultural level. And then when I learned about permaculture, it was like, yeah, and this is this is the how-to part. This is the how we grow food part and how we sustain ourselves while we do this part. I think there's a great value in, again, applying the shift even to something as concrete as your garden. Well, hopefully your garden's not concrete. But, it was interesting to me after I took my first permaculture course, I came back home and I was like, yeah, I understand. This is not about just planting a garden in rows. It's about creating a little ecosystem. It's about understanding how everything fits together. And if you can make that shift in thinking in your garden, you can also understand that some of the things you learn in your garden might actually apply to other areas of life. We are fond of every time we see something or experience something that we don't like or we feel is threatening, again, at least in the US, we declare war on it. War on drugs, war on terror. Something's bad out there, those bad people, nuke them, kill them, get rid of them. Just like we declare war on bugs in the garden. And of course, if you're doing industrial, conventional agriculture, you see a pest in the garden, get out the spray, nuke it, kill it dead, get rid of it. The problem is when you try to kill that bug, you're spraying your food with poison, which most of us, if we stopped and thought about it, might think it's probably not a really great thing to do. If you're a permaculturalist, you look at that bug in your garden, you go, that bug is information. That bug is telling me something's not working in my system. Maybe my plant is vulnerable because maybe the soil needs feeding. Maybe I'm growing too many of the same plant too close together. I'm creating beautiful habitat for the bug, right? And maybe if I mixed it up with some fragrant herbs, that would confuse the bug, and it wouldn't be able to find its way so easily. Maybe I need to plant something that's going to bring in predators that are going to eat that bug. Maybe what I need to do is say, what are the conditions that are favoring this pest? And change those conditions so that they'll favor the things that I want. Now imagine if we thought about that politically. If instead of saying, let's kill the terrorists, we stopped and said, well, what are the conditions that are breeding this response? And how can we change those conditions so that we're not creating fertile habitat for terror, but we're actually creating fertile habitat for connection and growth and understanding. It favors terrorism to have right-wing hatred and racism and Islamophobia because it generates the resentment and the fear that recruits more people to those organizations. So I think we can learn a lot if we understand that nature actually has patterns and ways of working, and we understand what those things are. They can often guide us in many, many areas of our life, not just in how we put our garden together. I think we need to be building a movement, a worldwide movement for justice, for sanity, for ecological balance, for the understanding that the world is relational. And I think we need to make that movement one that is a welcoming movement. Now, by welcoming, I mean, first of all, it actually has to be a movement that encompasses a broad diversity of people. Not just people who look like us and think like us and come from the same background, but understanding that a movement for justice has to be a movement of people who are currently at the wrong end of the stick as far as injustice goes. And that we often need to take guidance and learn from what those people are telling us. I was fortunate enough over Thanksgiving to go to Standing Rock, where there was this tremendous uprising of Indigenous First Nations people from across the US and some from Canada that came to stand up against a pipeline that was being built to carry oil underneath a lake across sacred lands of the Lakota people, and that threatened the drinking water, not just of the tribe and their lands, but actually of everyone downstream on the Missouri River. And I'm sure as many of you have read about it, heard about it, are familiar with it from the news. It was a tremendous event. It was a time when tribes got together who had not been in coalition, had not worked together, sometimes for hundreds of years or ever. And for me, going there, you sort of walked up to the camp and there was a big, big sign at the entrance. And the sign said, "You are entering a place of prayer and ceremony." And it was very powerful. I spent decades telling people, well, I think, the spiritual and the political aren't separate. They need to go together. Like when we do politics, when we do political action, we need to have a base in our deep values. When we do spirituality, it needs to be engaged with the world if it's going to be real. If we're going to do political action, we need spirituality, or we need something because it's hard and we're going to get burned out if we don't have something to feed and nourish us. Because what happened in Europe was, up until about 16th, 17th century, Europe was Christian, but it wasn't that Christian. It's kind of like Mexico today, where, you know, things are nominally Christian, but actually they're still doing the same kinds of rituals and ceremonies they always were. They just maybe are using different words, or they're doing it at the church. You still have curanderas, and you have healers and brujas and all of that. Well, that's what Europe was like. And the rich people were Christian, but the ordinary peasants kind of did all the old ceremonies they'd always done to connect to the land, to honor the changing of the seasons, to celebrate the harvest. And that was fine up until a certain point in history. The late 1400s, to be precise, which was, interestingly enough, same time when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and where other things were changing in Europe. I've always been interested that the witch persecutions were not actually medieval. They were Renaissance. They were early modern. And I think that ties into deep social and economic changes that were going on. I wrote about it a long time ago in a book called Dreaming the Dark. There's also a book by Silvia Federici called Caliban and the Witch that talks about it. But in some ways, those were times kind of like this. And they were times when a lot of the established order was being shaken up. And part of that was economic. As the New World got developed, people brought in all this gold that they found in South America and Central America, and it caused this enormous inflation in Europe. And suddenly the old landholders whose power base had been holding land were having a hard time economically because of it. And the people who were making money were the new merchants, and there was a whole new class that was rising. Science was starting to develop, and there was push to develop land in a different way, to mine at deeper levels than anyone had ever mined before, to take nature and sort of wrench her secrets out of her. And there was challenges to the church like there had never been before, with the Protestant Reformation and with lots and lots of social movements and peasant rebellions. So in times like that, the powers that be really love a scapegoat. They really love to have something to focus everyone's attention and fears on. And witches were a great thing, kind of like terrorists today. You know, why should you focus all your energy and all your rebellion against your overlord, who's actually the one oppressing you, when we can convince you that it's that crazy old woman down the way who's putting a curse on you? And the witch persecutions erupted and spread throughout Europe, and they were conducted in ways that, if you were accused of being a witch, basically you were tortured until you confessed. And if you didn't confess, it didn't mean that you weren't a witch, it meant that you were stubborn. So there were towns in Germany where after the witch hunters came through, there were hardly any women left alive. They were primarily directed against women, although not exclusively. There were about 20% of the people who were accused and killed were also men. I think the result of the witch persecutions is they left a deep sort of cultural legacy. A legacy that sort of said, any knowledge that's not officially stamped with the approval of the authorities is dangerous. Any woman who stands up and is powerful and effective is dangerous and possibly evil. It meant that healing traditions that weren't the ones approved of by the authorities were seen as dangerous and evil. And it meant that anything that had to do with your intuitive connection to the earth, with understanding the earth is alive and sacred, with understanding that sacredness was embodied and that the universe was dynamic and changing, that became something suspect and evil. And I think that legacy still holds today. If we can do that, if we can release some of that fear, then I think we also are actually at a very exciting moment in history. Because the other really surreal aspect about climate change is that not only are we not paying attention to it, but when we do, we sort of sink into this morass of despair and despondency as if there were nothing we could actually do about it, which may be partly why we don't pay more attention to it. But actually, there's an enormous amount that we can do about it. And the things that we need to do about it are actually not like grim, horrible, terrible, painful things. Right? You know, they don't mean that you have to like give up living a decent life and go lie on the ground in the cold and shiver through a freezing Canadian winter in nothing but a bearskin. It means we have to take horrible, poisonous, toxic industries and stop extracting them and shift to clean, safe renewables. Like, what's not to like about that? And we can, you know, and we actually can power the world in ways that are clean and that are healthy and that are not going to be like destroying the lands and the lives of indigenous people like a lot of oil extraction is. It means that we probably need to stop shipping food and commodities and everything we make and touch all over the world and producing them in the places where it's cheapest and labor gets paid the least and environmental standards are the most lax, and actually bring enterprises home and relocalize them and produce the things we need somewhere close to where we need them. It means we need to stop growing our food by pouring poisons on them and herbicides and pesticides and chemical fertilizers on the soil that are destroying the soil and destroying our land and giving us food that actually isn't nourishing and is toxic. And we need to grow food in ways that are healthy and that actually regenerate the soil and regenerate the land and provide habitat for wildlife. It means we have to stop clear-cutting our forests and protect them and plant new forests and have beautiful gardens and trees. And ultimately, it means we need community. Because I think if there is one word that's an antidote to climate change, it's community. You know, we need to start building those human relationships that give our lives value and connection, that give us a sense of belonging and a sense that we can make a contribution to other people that's valued and that's important. And when we have that community, then we can do all the rest of it. All the rest of it falls into place. And we need a lot less stuff, right? And have a lot more things like time and love and friendship and good conversations and really good food and potlucks. All those things that make life worth living. So, in order to do that, again, I think we first of all need to understand and believe that it's possible. I want to offer you a couple of resources, especially for those of you who are scientists or need to argue this with scientists. There's a wonderful book by Eric Toensmeier, Toensmeier, called The Carbon Farming Solution. And he looks at the ways that we can shift our land use, not just to avoid putting more emissions into the atmosphere, but to actually regenerate the land. And I think that's a key, again, to shift on climate change, is understanding it's not just about the numbers and the carbon and the methane, whatever. What we're looking at is massive ecosystem degeneration that goes along with massive social system degeneration. And so the cure for it is massive ecosystem regeneration on a large scale. And the wonderful thing is, like, we actually know how to do that, and we can do that, and it is being done in a number of different places. So Eric's book is a great, great resource for that. Another great resource, if you like to look at videos, if you go on the web, John Liu, L-I-U, has a video, a number of videos about what has been done in China on the Loess Plateau, which was the birthplace of the Chinese people, and was originally this tremendously fertile land, but has been degraded over thousands of years of agriculture and farming and overgrazing to the point where it was really desertified. And the Chinese government decided to regenerate the land, and they brought in people who used some of the tools of permaculture, water harvesting, terracing, capturing the water that falls on the land and infiltrating it instead of letting it run off, replanting and reforesting. And now that land has been regenerated, an area the size of Belgium, you know. And it didn't take 50 years, you know. It happened within a decade. There's a man I heard speak at the International Permaculture Convergence named Tony Ronaldo from World Vision. And he talks about working in North Africa, where they were trying to plant trees and trying to stop the Sahara Desert from expanding into the Sahel, the area on the edge. And he said they would plant trees and plant trees and plant trees, and the trees would die. And they plant more trees, and the trees would die. Finally, one day he was out there in total despair and discouragement, just staring at the ground. And he noticed there were all these like little nubby little bushes, things that were totally like overgrazed and just little stubs. As he looked at them, he realized, oh, they were actually trees. They were trees that had been bitten down so much they just were tiny little, you know, scrubby things. But he got the idea, what if we just protected them? And what if we taught farmers to put a little fence around them, keep the goats from eating them, prune them down to one stem so they grow up more like a tree and less like a bush? And he developed this thing he calls FMNR, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. And within months, they started to have trees growing. I want to read you just a few things I think of as proverbs of Starhawk about political organizing. I would say if we're thinking about building movements, we need to bring in people who have not yet been activists, and we need to welcome them. Any of you ever trained a dog? You know, when you're training a dog, they tell you, never beat a dog for coming back to you. I think of movements in social change need to be ecosystems. They need to have many niches. Again, sometimes activists get in these really fruitless arguments about, like, my tactic's better than yours. You're doing that, that won't do any good. You know, people, you ever heard everyone say, like, you know, I heard about the big, huge, giant women's march after Trump was inaugurated. Oh, what good did that do? Just people marching, they don't pay any attention to that. Well, that's true. No march is going to do anything. No one action, no signing one petition or making one call is going to do anything. It's the ecosystem they create when people are calling and marching and writing petitions and standing up. And each of those things has its own function. You know, just like you know, if you plant a fava bean in your garden, it has a different function than if you plant a carrot. And yelling at the fava bean because it's not a carrot is not going to, or yelling at the carrot because it's not a rabbit, and yelling at the rabbit because it's not a wolf, is not really going to get you anywhere. And so understanding if you want to build a broad-based movement, it's got to have things in it people can do that are broad and that invite in the broadest possible number of people. I say use language that speaks to people's hearts and values. Language of poetry and of magic. You ever heard activists using language that comes from academia or that's so jargony nobody but your 3 fellow activists can understand it, right? We can shift away from that and realize that making change is a form of art. It is an art of changing consciousness at will. So we need to apply art, and that means we need to look at the things that really move people. And that is language that touches senses and images and smells and touches and tastes, not language that's so abstract that you need a graduate degree in linguistics to follow it. We need to reward movement in the right direction. Again, this comes from dog training. It's the modern theory of dog training. It's like you don't wait till your dog sits perfectly to reward them. You're teaching your puppy to sit, and the puppy twitches their hindquarters. You reward that, and every movement that the dog makes towards sitting gets a little bit more of a reward. Well, I think we can do that with politicians too. They very rarely are where we want them to be, but we can reward them when they twitch in the right direction. And along with that, I also say, don't throw away power because it isn't as much as you want. And that goes to things like voting. But I'll tell you a story. I was in England, and I met a guy who was on the town council of Glastonbury. Now, Glastonbury is the place that in ancient times was called Avalon. It's like the magical heart of Britain. And today it's kind of the magical heart, but also sort of the New Age crystal shop heart of Britain. It's like, has a main street full of goddess stores and crystals, and everybody goes around flowing robes, and people meditate, and there's a million different kinds of spiritual things going on. There's a big goddess festival there every year. He was saying that they had an election where one of the issues was fracking in this ancient landscape. This is the landscape that holds the sacred waters of Chalice Well, the amazing, again, sacred heart of Britain, and they're talking about fracking. Right? And the pro-fracking councillor won by something like 2 or 3 votes. And what he said is all the beautiful people in the flowing robes don't come out to vote. I'm like, I don't want to deal with the negativity, and I'm going to, right? And, and I think we need to vote. We need to deal with the negativity. Go vote, because it may not be much power, but it's more power than having no power. And when you put that power together, it can have a lot of power. And if you want more power than your vote represents, again, magically speaking, if you throw away the power that you have, it's like you're saying to the universe, I don't care about this. And the universe is not going to shower more power on you. It's going to say, okay, it's someone who isn't interested in this. And power will start to leak away from you in other ways. So if you want more power, use the power that you have and build on it. So we have only a few things we need to do. We need to change our technology, our economy, our energy systems, our food growing systems, our social systems, and our way of life, right? And the thing is, they all really need changing. So climate change, we can look at it also as this enormous opportunity. This can be the spur that gets us up off of our duff and says, you know what? This world is not working on so many different ways. If we do the things we need to do to regenerate the environment on a large scale, we also have to do the things we need to do to regenerate our social systems on a large scale. And we actually have the potential to create a world that's better for everybody, that's more just, that's more balanced, that's cleaner, that's more beautiful, that's more pleasurable, that's healthier. And I believe that every single one of us in this room and every single one of us in this world has a vital and important role to play. And to look around and say, and I'm also going to support my friends and my comrades and my neighbors in the things that they are doing, so that we can weave a web where we care for one another, where we create a world that actually will be a loving and nurturing and welcoming one for one another and for all the generations that come after us. So, I'd love to open it up for questions, discussion.
Even in terms of elections, I guess from kind of a magical ceremonial worldview, I've looked at elections as like sort of as a ceremony and as like kind of a giant illusion puppet show ceremony kind of thing, the legitimacy of which our participation tends to maintain, because my take on it so far has been kind of like, that whole spectacle kind of needs to be disrupted somehow in order for that illusion and that spell to be broken.
I think you're not voting and not participating makes no difference whatsoever to the spectacle.